Whoa, wait a minute. What was that? Somebody walking barefoot in the snow? Let's go back and take a closer look. Those are bear tracks. In the middle of the night, my wife heard a big bang outside the window, and the next morning when I went outside, all the bird feeders were either on the ground or gone, and my yard was filled with all these bear tracks. Spring brings flowers, but it also brings bears. And that brings us to the story that I want to talk about today. Now, in the Bible, this story is very short. It's only 2 verses, and it goes like this. The prophet Elisha is traveling up to Bethel, and along the road, a bunch of people, Na'arim Katanim is the Hebrew, and we'll get into that in a minute, come out on the road, and they start shouting at him, go up, Baldy. And he becomes angry and turns around and curses them, and 2 female bears come out of the forest and slaughter 42 of these people. Not a very pleasant story, especially since the King James Version translates Na'arim Katanim as little children. But we're going to look at the original Hebrew right now and see that that probably is not an accurate translation. Here you see a partial list of some of the more common Bible translations, with the King James at the top rendering it little children, and most of the others followed suit with that. But is it accurate? This chart is a screenshot from Strong's Concordance, which counts the various word usages in the King James translation. And as you can see, child is not the most common translation of Na'ar. Number 1 is young man. Number 2 is servant. Now, number 3 is child, but then that's followed by lad, which does not have to be a small child. And so why they chose to render it children in this particular story, I don't know. But it is my opinion that it's a very poor translation. Okay, so if we allow that Na'arim does not necessarily mean children, it most of the time means something like young men, or it can mean servants in the sense of a stable boy or a bus boy or something like that. But it doesn't mean necessarily little tiny children. So then this changes the whole story. This isn't a bunch of kids out on a nature hike along the road. This is an angry mob of teenagers screaming and yelling and probably armed, because people back then always carried swords and knives and clubs and staffs and whatever. So this is a very threatening mob. But if that's the case, how come they're called Katan, small, in Hebrew? Well, for this we have to look at some Hebrew idioms. The rabbis in the Talmud ask exactly the same question, and they come to the conclusion the reason they're called Katan is not because they're little physically, it's because they are lacking in knowledge. They are like little children who don't know right from wrong. They don't know Torah. They don't know mitzvahs. They're a bunch of nobodies, a bunch of ignoramuses. Now, to really understand this, we have to look at the opposite of Katan, and that's Gadol, big. The Kohen Gadol, which is translated usually as high priest, literally means the big priest, and we're not talking about his size, talking about his social status, about his importance, his authority. He's like, as you say, the big kahuna in those old surfer movies. He's the leader, okay? And today, even to this day, we say Gadolim when we refer to great Torah scholars. These are the Gadolim. These are the great ones. So the opposite of Gadol, big, is Katan, small. And so a bunch of ignorant people, and by the way, they were probably idolaters, because Bethel had become a hotbed of idolatry at that point. And if you'll recall, Elisha was the disciple of Elijah, the prophet who staged a showdown between the priest of Baal and the true God. And so you got to figure that these idolaters in Bethel were not very happy to see a prophet of God coming to their town. Next, we're going to look at what they're shouting at him. Now, literally, it says, go up, bald head. And so, on the surface, it looks like they're just poking fun of some old guy because he's bald. And the bald thing, I've seen all kinds of commentaries going into what that might have been or might not have been. I think we can just assume they're insulting the guy. The more important thing is the go up. They're not saying go up to Bethel. They're not saying go up the mountain. They're not saying something like that. Remember, his teacher was Elijah the prophet, who was taken up into heaven in a flaming chariot. And no doubt Elisha has told this story. Others have told this story. And so when they're shouting, go up, they're telling him to drop dead. They're telling him, go to heaven, get out of here. So you put this all together, and you have an angry mob of idolaters threatening a prophet of God, shouting for him to be dead, probably waving weapons at him. And so he turns around and he curses them. Which brings us to the bears. Now the text tells us that 42 people were mauled, not necessarily killed, but 42 people were injured or killed by 2 female bears. Now, this is an absurd story. Bears are very shy animals when it comes to being around humans. One of the ways you avoid bears when you're hiking in the woods is to make noise, to sing or shout, play a radio, something or other, And we've got a mob of people shouting and yelling. Bears are going to run as far as they can go to get away from that. Now, the storyteller does make them female bears, which indicates that they might be angry because they have cubs around. But still, how could 2 bears kill 42 people? It's such an absurd story that the rabbis in the Talmud say it had to have been a miracle. And then they debate what kind of a miracle this was. And one opinion is that there was already a forest, so the miracle was simply that the bears appeared. Another opinion says, no, there was no forest there, so there had to be a forest created, and there had to be bears. And so the expression, no bears and no forest, in modern Hebrew and also in Yiddish, means there was nothing. It never happened. It's a tall tale. Lo dubim, lo ya'ar. No bears and no forest. Now, as I've said in some of my other videos, when you come to something that you don't understand on a physical level, it doesn't make any sense literally, then you look for a deeper meaning. And I'll also say when you find numbers in the Bible, they usually do have some kind of a significance. So I asked myself, is there some kind of meaning to the number 42? Now, fans of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy are probably laughing now because if you know the book or the movie, they had this big computer called Deep Thought, and they asked it to give them the meaning of life, the universe, and everything else. And after millions of years of calculating, it told them that the meaning of life was 42.
42? Is that all you've got to show for 7.5 billion years' work?
Now, Douglas Adams, the author of Hitchhiker's Guide, said there was no meaning to 42, that he simply picked a number out of the air because the whole book, after all, is a satire, it's a joke. However, reality is often stranger than fiction because in Judaism, the number 42 does have a meaning. It refers to the sacred 42-letter name of God. And there's some debate as to actually what those letters are, and I'm not going to get into that. But this is a rather common idea in Jewish mysticism. If you Google it, you'll find 42-letter name of God has a lot of different references. You can even get an app for your iPhone to meditate on one of the versions. Now, the Talmud says about the 42-letter name that if one is humble and pious and mature, controlling their temper, that they can use the 42-letter name to control the forces of nature. In other words, this is a mystical incantation to create miracles. So here's how I would like to tie all of this together. The prophet Elisha is walking along the road to Bethel, which is a hotbed of idolatry. A mob of young men comes out and shouts at him and wants him to drop dead. He turns and uses the 42-letter name to curse them. Whether there were bears or whether there was a forest isn't really the point. The point is that we should control our anger because our words do have power. No, maybe we can't conjure up forests and bears, but when we shout at somebody, when we insult somebody, when we yell at somebody, when we curse somebody, those words have an effect, and they do bring harm to other people. And so Jewish tradition does not hold Elisha up on a pedestal for doing this. There are many commentators that say he was wrong. He should not have cursed the crowd, that he was out of control. And from this, we can learn that we have to control our thoughts, our speech, and our actions.